Welcome, everybody. So, we have our Wednesday Bible study, and we're doing griefs and gratitudes. And I had the opportunity to preach at the Peace Community Church in Windsor. And so I introduced the brown grief bags and to that church. And then they didn't get the fancy bags like we did for our gratitudes, but we had an assignment that you could fill your griefs in here and wad them up and kick them or burn them or stomp on them or whatever. And then we have the gratitude bags to fill for the month, one thing, a different thing every day that you can think of to be grateful for. So that was the assignment from a couple weeks ago. So anybody able to fill their bags up? Anybody been able to do that? I've been preaching to myself, so I got some gratitudes in here. So we had lots of things that COVID has given us to think about in terms of griefs and gratitudes. And I was thinking would, what Bible passage would really reflect that part of griefs and gratitudes. And I came up with the prodigal son. And you might want to say some more about any of the griefs that you're experiencing currently before we get into the prodigal son. Anybody want to talk about griefs that they're burdened with? I've been thinking about Brenda in Peace Community Church. Is she doing okay?
We haven't heard in the last couple days, but we she talked Monday about possibly, or Sunday, I don't know, sometime about getting tested, and we haven't heard any results as to whether or not she went or not.
So she had a real high fever and didn't know what was the cause of it. And so,
Right, 103.9 or something like that.
yeah, that's really bad. So I was hoping that she was doing better, but nobody's really heard, I guess.
After that, she said she was doing better and not no temperature, but I don't know whether she went to get tested, whether she went to work, or what the latest is.
Wow, yeah. Uh, I heard that one of the pastors in our district and his wife had COVID. So that's John Tuttle in the
Prairie View
Prairie View.
Church.
Yeah, so that's near Garden City. So he's recovered, but I was thinking of him and his wife Deb. So that's not encouraging. And
Um,
welcome, Celia.
Hi, Celia.
Hi, hello, welcome. Hi.
Uh,
I did. I
we're
didn't
talking
see.
we're
I
talking
was
about
just going to say Bob's mom passed away about 3 weeks ago, so obviously that's a grief and a loss. But I mean, we'll probably touch on this. Grief and loss can get wrapped around each other too. So gratitude can get wrapped into that. So she was 93 or 4, and it's okay to go, and that is an inevitable. So it was there's a gratitude for a long life and a life well lived and a large family. And so yeah, and I always find that the loss of one sorry the loss of one somebody, particularly a family member, brings up the loss of another somebody. So it
right,
just they just all connect. uh,
right.
so
And there's just been way too many people passing, so that's the hard part of the pandemic. Yeah, there is gratitude, um, but I don't know that anybody is ever exactly ready for a loved one to be
right,
gone.
right.
Anybody else have a grief or gratitude they wanted to mention this evening?
Travel to the
I
Midwest to see.
want to say that I'm very grateful that I have a job still because we had a ton of layoffs and it was massive across numerous divisions. And I'm really grateful for that.
Wow. Wow. And others did not fare as well, so that's a sadness and a gratitude, right? Well, I'm scared for corporations because they scare me sometimes when they do layoffs, and I don't know. I'm glad you're still on the employed list.
You know, I mean, the shooting of the guy getting into the car, you know, that's such a grief. And my gratitude is I had a bite of tomato fresh from the garden, and it's just heavenly.
Wow. Larry, did you have something to add? I didn't hear.
We had hoped to travel to the Midwest to see family and on to Illinois, where we lived for 24 years, to see church friends there. The pastor there, who I helped to recruit, and who had been there 14 years, is retiring, and next Sunday's her last Sunday. But with the virus, we thought, no, we better stay home.
That is part of the grief of this pandemic, yeah. And and Bob and Vicky didn't travel for a funeral or whatever the service was. Yeah.
Yeah. And additionally, we're supposed to RSVP today for the wedding of a niece for Bob, and same thing as Larry. Nope, don't think we're gonna travel to Illinois to do that. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a sadness for sure. Well, I was thinking about this parable. What story would have the opportunity to talk about griefs and gratitudes? And this is a great story no matter what the topic is. You can make it apply to a lot of different topics, but especially family drama. This is a great this is a great parable to talk about what families go through. So, what does this say about grief? And my first question is, who thought that life was unfair in this parable? Oh, Fred, you think life is unfair? Is that what you're saying?
I do. Uh, I've been tremendously blessed in my life. Just couldn't ask for it to be better. But I don't think it works that way for everybody. And it does seem unfair to me. I spent over 40 years running public welfare departments, and I've just seen a lot of people that it just didn't seem to me they could get a fair shake.
Wow. Firsthand view of people going through the hardest times in their life. Yeah. Well, there's much evidence now that we see that COVID is not fair. It's not treating people fairly. And it's exponentially harder for persons who are marginalized already to be victims of COVID. But if we start in this story, if someone wants to read verses 11 through 16, or whatever version you have, you want to read the first part?
Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything.
Okay, so I've been thinking about why that son would feel the way he did. Why? What was the son feeling? Do we think the younger son?
Hungry.
Yeah. Well, before he left home, he was feeling something that was pretty unsettling. What was he feeling before he even left home?
Life is not fair.
Yeah, what's with this older brother stuff? Getting like, any of you have an older brother? So
Yep.
why do they get all the bennies and they get all the perks? And who said that was, that was a good idea? Dave, you're not talking.
I am listening at the moment.
You're the middle child. You should have something
Yeah.
frustrating to say.
Well, yeah, family dynamics are always interesting. I'll say that.
So obviously there was a societal aspect to this, and who knows, maybe the older brother was a really nice guy. Maybe the older brother picked on his little brother. I don't know. But we know that the younger brother wanted to go away. So um, let's go ahead and read the rest of the scripture. And who wants to read that 17 through 20?
I'll read it, Gail.
All right. Thank you.
When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father."
And
Get me
then
going.
the next paragraph, yeah.
Okay. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around, and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son."
All right. Someone want to finish up the rest of the story? So verse 22 to 30.
You want me to finish?
Celia, is that you? Yeah,
Yes.
she'll do it. Okay.
But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes come home, you killed a fattened calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.
Okay. Welcome, Lyle. I see your internet is still working. We're happy for internet, for for giving gratitude for internet. So, who has a reason to grieve? Is there anybody in the story that has a reason to grieve? I can see this like a movie playing out. Who's grieving in this movie?
The older son
The older son is grieving. I can see
and the father.
father seems
The
to be
father
really
was,
sad.
he's feeling fulfilled at this moment.
Yeah,
Uh, and so everybody is feeling good except the older son.
when the rejoicing happens, yeah.
Yeah.
So do you see why each person might have a reason to feel grief? You know, you don't get to tell people that they're allowed or not allowed to feel grief. They're allowed to feel however they feel. But I think I can relate to some of these people in this story. Does anybody want to admit who they relate to in this story?
Well, I think you're right. You could relate to any one of them given any certain set of circumstances. I have two daughters that are 10 years apart, and I find it interesting trying to figure out how to be fair to both of them. Both of them feel like I favored the other one, which makes it kind of interesting. And so that it makes me feel good because if they both feel like they've been shorted a little bit, it seems like maybe I haven't done too badly.
If no one's happy, then you've done your job. Yeah.
I mean, they're both great kids, and they don't, they get along well. In fact, I spent last Saturday with both of them up in the mountains, and we just had a great time together. But it is interesting trying to figure out how you can love two kids that are very different in different ways, and try not to show partiality.
Right. So do we know if the father liked one of the sons more than the other in this story?
I don't think
I,
we know either way, actually. I mean, one of the thing about the Bible stories is we don't generally get internal uh, dialogue. In other words, we don't know what people were thinking. We generally get their actions. So it's like this, the prodigal. Maybe he figures, yeah, I really did blow it, but maybe he's just, I'm out of money and I know where the trough is, or I can go back and get some more. I mean, I need, another, it's sort of like that. Does he need tough love?
Well, or
Uh,
does he need welfare?
Well, yeah. I mean, maybe he's just. I mean, there's all kinds of stories, right? If you think about AA, right? So somebody comes back and says, I'm just gonna, I really screwed up, and I'll do better." And sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. We don't know anything about what the prodigal is thinking. We can speculate. It's true of the others as well.
Well, he did say he came to his senses. We do know he was a little bit what he was thinking when he was hungry. Kathy, did you start to say something? I think I cut you off.
I was just saying when I look at this, I think the father was showing unconditional love for both of his sons. For the one that stuck by him through times, and then the other one that came back and said, "Gosh, my father, I blew it." And he sort of an acceptance, right? You accept the person for what they are. That's
Yeah,
where I'm
you said the same thing as this commentary, this big, thick, fat commentary, saying that that's love of the Father is such a profound example of what it might be like, that God is like that, accepts us as we are. We've screwed up and we've come back, and we might not have been perfect, but God still takes us back in.
I didn't read the book.
Well, you don't have to because you just now got it. I'm thinking that a lot of times I'm the big brother, and I can totally see how um, the Church of the Brethren likes people to straighten up and fly right, and to not act out, and to not go to not go to those beaches during COVID-19 and party and have all that spread of disease, and go to college and spread all that disease. Um, I'm really thinking like the big brother when I see that on TV. It's like, stop that. You should not be doing that. But I'd like to think of myself as the hero, but maybe if I'm honest, I'd have to admit that I have that other law and order kind of thing in my genetics.
Well, and it seems to me that some of this could be age related. I mean, as I understand it, the judgment part of the brain doesn't really develop in men until they're around 25 years of age. So, perhaps it would be a normal expectation that the younger brother, depending upon his age, just wasn't fully developed yet. He still was experiencing a lot of adolescence. So, I mean, there's several different ways a guy could look at it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can certainly identify with any of them on any given, context. So I can be a parent, as I am a parent, looking at my two really different sons and what they do. And when I shake my head and scratch my head, going, what are they thinking? And, and then how I connect or don't connect with each of them. And I'm the oldest in the family, so I'm sure there's. Well, I can remember my little brother looking up at me saying, "You just wait till I'm bigger than you are." So there was some tension probably going on. He was feeling something. I was fine, but I was the big sister. So, so there's that. And then the times that I myself have wandered and strayed away and made stupid decisions, so and regretted it, and been aggrieved by that. So yeah, just give me a context and I can be somebody.
Um, this Bible story reminds me of Rumspringa. Is that how did I say that, Lyle? Is that an Amish term, Rumspringa, for, you can unmute yourself, Lyle?
I don't quite figure out what you're saying on it, but
When the
Lyle,
Room
yes,
Springer. You got it. Yeah, basically right.
Rumspringa, when the Amish are told to go out and be in the world, and don't come back until they've gotten all the worldliness out of themselves. Don't join the church until they've tried to be in the world for a while. Has anybody been part of that culture? That's an Amish tradition, I believe. So
Is it similar to when a parent has a child who, for whatever reason, will not listen? And sometimes the parents are forced to like tell the child to, if you want to do as you want, you don't want to listen, then you need to leave. And the child leaves and has to go figure out the world for his or herself. And eventually, hopefully, you hope that what they learn teaches them that what is at home is real love and caring, and the streets are not as kind, and that they return home. Because I know parents who have done that with their kids, and it worked, and I know parents who have done it and it has not worked, but it kind of seems like a similar thing.
Right. Very much so. Vivian, did you have something you weren't added?
No, I'm just listening.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well,
Well, I think Celia's point is really right on. There are no guarantees, and which should make all of us who have had kids or whatever, or we're all kids. Our parents maybe are gone, but there's a lot of humility there. And I'll just throw in another. The one thing about texts. So we're reading this text, and it's about the father and the two sons. There's no mention of a mother. And one of the things that I've learned from it's sometimes called feminist biblical scholarship, or is trying to bring women's, and it can be anything. It could be slaves, whatever. In other words, what's the context? How would this be read from, if you consider this, from another context, or who's not in the story that maybe should be in the story? We don't know. There's no indication in this story. But if you wanted to be true to family dynamics, add in a female perspective in terms of what's going on, and not just do that from the 21st century perspective, but from the first century.
so Fred, your two daughters would not inherit anything, evidently.
Say that again. My two daughters, what?
Would not inherit anything in this story, evidently.
Yeah, true.
So if there's a sister, I bet she would have an opinion, maybe, if what's going on here.
Well, and it's some of the reason for, and David, you're the biblical scholar here, but it seemed to me that in the old days, women weren't recognized really a lot of times in the Old Testament, just kind of period, and maybe the New Testament as well.
Yeah, definitely so. And sometimes it's called reading between the lines, I guess, or there is a whole field of women's. Well, there's a Bible commentary called the Women's Bible Commentary, and if you actually it was written with that title back in around 1890, and then 1990 there was a centenary edition of that. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, if you know her, who she was the person who wrote the women's. It's called the Women's Bible Commentary. Pretty interesting. And the one in 1990 was by a whole group of women's scholars.
But when I started looking at this story, I thought about, I could blame a lot of things of that on grief, on personal sin. It's like, well, you were dumb enough to go off and leave your ask for your inheritance, and you were dumb enough to go and spend your money on prostitutes, and you were dumb enough to do be mad because you're the older brother. There's a lot of personal sin, but then I started looking at the societal sin, and it's like, hey, wait a minute, maybe there's a lot of unfairness and things that I never looked like you just said about the women's thing. We don't know how the women might have seen this as something to grieve about. And who decided? I mean, the father agreed to give the son that money. He didn't have to say yes. What was dumb? What was he? What dumb idea was that, to say yes to this kid? So there's a whole lot of bigger picture here that I hadn't thought about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you say goes back to what you were saying earlier about how this story is so sort of reminiscent of the way God deals with us, because God gives us our free will. You don't want to serve me, you can go out there and see what's in the world, but at whatever point we decide that we want to come back, his arms are always open to us. And I think it's very much, there's a really great parallel, like you were saying earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that story that Kathy picked up and Celia's picking up, you're going to serve somebody, and so figure it out. Are you going to serve a crazy street kind of society or culture, or are you going to serve a God who loves you, who says, "Yeah, maybe you messed up on that one, but come on back, and you're loved anyway." It's probably why this is a popular a popular parable. And Vicky wins the $10,000 prize because she has the Women's Bible Commentary on the screen there. Way to go. So I think we need to look at the flip side then. What does this say about gratitude? And it kind of talks about grace too, unmerited favor.
I would certainly agree with that, Gail. I've certainly done things that I deserved for things to turn out very poorly, and they didn't. And my judgment at times was way short of where it should have been, and yet I was blessed in my life anyway. And you know, so in that regard, I'm glad life isn't fair, and God isn't fair.
Right, and you saw people who didn't get the happy ending to their story, like you said in your job with welfare. It didn't turn out nearly as lucky for them or as grace filled.
The parable is a parable, and as such, you can extract any amount of meaning out of it. And for me, it's the prodigal is pretty much there as a prop. He's there, but the real part I focus on is the contrast between the forgiving father and the older brother, who would be a lot like us rather than being loving and forgiving, and which we keep having. And, I was just thinking about some folks schismatic in the church. If you don't do what I say, I'm picking up my marbles and leaving and writing a creed that you have to agree to, or else. And the older brother is all around us, and pointing fingers and pouting.
Right. So
And I was just going to say the older brother's emotional intelligence is not very well developed. It's not as evolved as it could be. And that's all on the older brother. That's not on anybody but him to figure out that what grace is and what gratitude is, and this sense of, well, I'm owed this. You owe me this. He has a pretty black and white way, I think, of looking at the world, or it's a more simplified 10-year-old way of looking at the world. Don't jump on my child development interpretation.
Well, he wants things to be fair or just. I mean, Fred, you're talking about your daughters, and not knowing anything about your daughters, but maybe one of them would say, hey, you're just not really being fair. And maybe an outsider would say that. One of the things in the story is verse 26, he had to, he hears the party. He knows nothing about anything that's going on. The party's already going on. And one of his slaves asks what was going on. It's the slave that tells him. In other words, his dad doesn't tell him. Nobody else, nobody tells him anything. And so then he reacts, which I can kind of understand, like, okay. And the parable does not tell us whether the father and the elder son reconcile. And there's no indication about that. It's just, the father says, you've always been with me. We have to celebrate your brother that's come back. Well, maybe the older brother maybe accepts that, but maybe he never does. Sounds a lot like families I know and some of the people I know in my family.
Oops.
I think time could play a role too. For my daughters are 10 years apart, and my wife and I were different people. And so in essence, we had different families 10 years apart in terms of what our views of child rearing were, our, how we interacted with the world. And so not only were they somewhat genetically different, but environmentally, they were raised differently as well.
Right. It's almost like two only children when they're that far apart. Well, I can certainly see why the brother would have reason to be angry. They had time to go butcher a calf, hire musicians, get a party thrown together, and nobody even had the wherewithal to say, "Hey, isn't there somebody missing from the party?" They don't even look for him. So it's like, well, that was kind of rude and annoying. So I can see that would not be your best party etiquette. So the father gets to talk about what he's grateful for. We don't see the older son being grateful for anything, do we? Is the older son?
Well, the older son obviously does not share the father's attitude. And the worst thing for me is I've known prodigals that resurfaced, and the parent would do anything, sacrifice any of the other children to try to keep in a good relationship with the prodigal.
Which makes life very stressful for the others in the family. It could be result in a lot of anger and resentment.
One other thing and you're absolutely right, Lyle, this is a story, so there's not a lot of detail in this thing, but I wonder too, did dad redivide up the goods when the prodigal son came home, or did he have a party and then that was pretty much it?
Well, the scripture says, that was one of the things in the commentary. The scripture says, give him a robe and sandals and a ring. So evidently the fathers hadn't given the son all of that. But there's some of these rules that were Jewish rules that you couldn't give away anything till the father's dead. So it was kind of like a going outside of the written law to do some of these things.
So, okay, the part I'm not sure I'm understanding is like when the father passed away in those days, would the inheritance still be divided between those two children?
I think that it's I think you only get to divide once, and so once the younger son got it, that was supposed to be dunsies. You're out. It's over.
And so the older son would not lose in his inheritance. He just lost out on the party.
Right. The older son has all the things that would have been firstborn, rights of the firstborn. So the property, all the cattle, blah, 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 blah. And so he would have had a lot of things that eventually are going to be his.
Okay. And to me, that makes it it's harder for me to see him in a positive light if the only thing he's really lost here is a party, versus I could see him being more upset if he thought that the goods were going to be redivided and he was going to lose half of what he had to his younger brother.
Yeah, I think that's why the law was pretty clear that you don't get to do it twice.
Well, where did the ring and the robe and the fattened calf come from? Was that the older brother's inheritance that got snatched out from underneath him? It belonged to somebody later down the road. It would seem to be. And that's my other question is, as a second son, would he get less than the older son? Older son gets X, Y, and Z, and younger son gets X.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know lots about inheritance laws. I did a real quick search. It says a firstborn could get a double portion, but I don't know if that's first century Judaism or later on. I can't look that up really quick.
It's Deuteronomy 12:17, Deuteronomy 21:17. The
That
elder
it gets a double portion. Well, so on the one side you have that law. The other, the bigger context is there's a lot of stories in the Bible where the firstborn gets shafted. I'll use that language. So there's, in terms of getting, inheritance, or that the Joseph story, he's the youngest, David's the youngest, all those kinds of. So there's, that kind of motif is going to be resonating for folks who know those stories. Oh, here's another one of those. And, so that's a big context. Gail and I, we've been listening to some podcasts, and there's a Jewish New Testament scholar. Her name is Amy Jo Levine. She's really interesting. And the point she makes is, if you look back in Luke 15, all the stories in there, there's a bunch of parables. It's the lost coin, the lost sheep, and so putting them into that context as well, you leave the 99, you go after that one, you sweep that house until you find that lost coin. It doesn't matter you have all the other ones, you're going to find that lost coin. And so that also has an impact with the prodigal son story, looking at it in that context. So yeah, liberality of God's love, but there's always this kind of unfairness too. I mean, Jacob and Esau, another one.
With Jacob, we have where God gives the inheritance to the younger brother, who is very much a prodigal. So you have a biblical story that the maybe that the father gives the whole shebang to the prodigal, and that's quite possible, and that does happen in with Jacob and Esau.
Yeah.
We also have Abraham with Isaac and Ishmael.
Right. So lots of disgruntled sons in the Bible.
Well, and maybe there's something about, the liberality of God's love. I mean, that's also like the story where the workers come and the guys work all day and the guy works for an hour and they're both paid the same. So, why are there so many stories like this? Because it's touching some sort of nerve that, that'd be one of my intuitions, some sort of nerve that we just know things are supposed to be fair, and God somehow is not really in the fairness business, which is good. But if you're an elder son, you maybe question that a little bit.
What I'm looking at is the part of the story where the son goes off to a distant country and squandered his wealth in wild living. So evidently he couldn't stay in his Jewish town and do it. He had to go off to a Gentile town. And so there was always a choice for the society to live in this more rigid Jewish life, or to go off into this wild and crazy and fun-loving, distant country where you could do anything you wanted. And so it would always be that, like that little temptation, like the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other, trying to tell you how you should live your life. And so we learn a lot about what's out there, because the brother doesn't know where his brother has been, but he says he's been squandering his property with prostitutes. So we guess that the older brother knows what's out there, but he didn't fall for it, evidently, is what the older brother is trying to say. He's been trying to, hold that together and not to go off and run off and be tempted by that other lifestyle. I think that has a lot to do with what we're seeing in college campuses and the whole COVID-19. How do you stay home? And it's boring, and there's mom and dad, and you live in your parents' basement.
Well, and to me, that's part of your psychological development, is going through that emancipation process again in your mid to later teenage years, and trying to figure out who you are and separating yourself from the rest of the family, and believing that you've kind of captured the world of knowledge, and someday your parents may catch up.
Very well said.
Yeah, and I'm guessing the younger brother, if he's feeling resentment about his status in society, and he's the second son, he doesn't get as much as his big brother does, and the heck with all of this, I know what I can do and have a good time. So yeah, I can totally identify with all of them. My
Right.
own personal emotional intelligences don't quite reach to the graciousness of the father oftentimes.
Right.
So
Yeah. And thankfully, there's a hope that some of us might live up to what the father was doing, because the father could have said, I mean, what's the law say? The father could have said what to the younger son?
You're dead to me.
You're dead to me. I gave you, you blew it. Boy, we've seen that in family dynamics, right? The child is disowned or disinherited.
well, and then grace is given. Is grace given equally? Do I get my bucket of grace filled up and then that's it, or do I need more, or do I need to give more, or yeah, where's the whole gratitude thing going there? How gracious am I to others when they need it or mess
Right.
up or whatever?
So some of this he brought on himself, and some of it was way outside his control, is what I'm thinking for each of the characters. Some of it they brought on themselves, and some of it was out of their control. And I look at COVID-19, and I didn't do anything to cause COVID-19 that I know of. Maybe I did, but not that I know of. And why am I having to suffer through separation and all this stuff? And I can be that can cause a lot of emotional trauma for me or for anyone. But the other side is I have never been so aware of the things that I used to take for granted. So I have clean air some of the time. things that we just are or could use as a reminder of what we could be grateful for. Is anyone else having that same kind of aha moment with gratitude? There's some nods.
This isn't really related to that, but as you talk about the COVID-19 issue, I have noticed that I've had moments when my feelings haven't been appropriate toward those who do not believe COVID is an issue, and therefore they don't do anything in a protective sense. And I sometimes certainly have thoughts that cross my mind that, why don't you care? And I understand why they don't care, and when I think it through, I'm okay. But my initial emotional response is, why are you messing it up for the rest of us? Because all you got to do is put on a mask and keep your distance and wash your hands,
Right. And what potential harm might you do to others if you don't follow any of those simple guidelines?
Gratitude is a practice. It's not just something that necessarily pops up just because it pops up. It probably does. It does do that. But if you want to experience gratitude, you need to practice it, which is what your exercise of, fill the bag up with. That's just one way of a quote discipline, and I'm saying that in a very positive sense, as in a learning practice kind of mode. And so it's how do we do that? And it's actually a mental health issue that's really highly functional in this stressful COVID-19 time. It's even more reason to practice gratitude in, as much as you can in each moment. What is there to be grateful for? And in the grand scheme of things, when I think of our Nigerian friends who are undergoing, burning and death and destruction and loss, and the capacity that those folks have for gratitude in the midst of wild destruction is like, wow. Yeah. So
We're
it's
like
really,
we're doing baby steps in comparison. So the last thing the father says is, this kind of testimonial. I've never left you. I've never forsaken you. I've never not loved you. I've never not wanted you to have everything. And he kind of gives him this pep talk and tries to share. To me, it's like, okay, you've only got this one lens with blinders on, but open up the blinders and see, whoa, all this other stuff that you haven't even been able to see. And that's what I think COVID is maybe helping me do, is to open up these blinders of what's out there. And I wish it were easy that everybody in this nation would say, let's protect the most vulnerable and everybody wear a mask. I mean, that would make my heart really glad. But I think we're kind of stuck like the father is. We just have to say, look, we're going to love you, and this is what it looks like from my perspective, and I need to love you, and can you please put on a mask? That not might not be what the moral of this parable is about.
I think maybe part of what the moral is is that regardless of how we see ourselves, there's room for improvement. None of us is as good or as great as we think we are. I mean, the prodigal son himself, he came to his own realization. The father, as a father, is trying, in a funny way, by accepting his son back, he's also created a division because now his older son is upset and he has to kind of win him back. And the older son has to learn forgiveness and has to learn to recognize that he thinks of himself as this good son who's been there for his dad the entire time, but he is kind of really selfish. And so I think it shows that, regardless of where we are on the scale and how we see ourselves, we also need to recognize that we can improve the person that we are.
And we're allowed to improve, right? We get a second chance to do that, or a third or fourth or a fifth chance to get.
The last verse that you were looking at, the word that came up for me, and I don't think it fits, but I can't quite make it not fit, is, in my thinking, is process. It's really the process that's going on, and this process of the younger brother, and everything. You've already got everything to the older brother. You're with me, and you got it all. And it's like, where's his gratitude for that? He can't see that. He doesn't feel it. He just feels that discrepancy. And so these pieces of, you could use the equity language, anyway, equality language. I don't, okay. I can't do anything with that. Be quiet.
No, that's true. And I'm thinking of the servant. It's like, well, what's your complaint? I've got nothing. I don't get any inheritance. I'm slopping the pigs. What's your problem, buddy? So, maybe it's all relative anyway. All right, on that note, I think we're going to have to move towards our end. We've thought about looking at the Lord's Prayer, and there was some things online that looked kind of interesting about using that as a study for Bible study. And I haven't looked at it recently, but I think that might be a place we'll go for next week.
Well, I have a comment about that. I'd rather, I think it's great to study the Lord's Prayer. That's a wonderful study. To devote 1 week to it seems to kind of shortchange a pretty intense kind of study that, so stretching it out, I'm not quite sure if you take it phrase by phrase, sentence by sentence, comma by comma, or what, but I think you could devote 2 or 3 or 4 weeks to it. That's all I'm encouraging.
I think the online version was more like that. It was dividing it into chunks, and yeah, so that's a little misnomer. The next week's might be, that's kind of what I was thinking.
Okay.
And you're welcome to suggest other items or topics also. Any thought? There's a thumbs up. Anybody?
Oh yeah, good for the Lord's Prayer.
Okay, couple votes for that. All right. Well, I'll try to send out a link or whatever I was looking at and see if I can make it apply to our Bible study. So we have a God who seems, one of my parishioners back in my early first days of ministry never darkened the door of a church, and he asked me, did I believe in the prodigal son story? Because he thought he was going to go to heaven no matter what. So he was banking on that prodigal son story, that I've never been to church, but by golly, I think I'm going to make it in. So I think maybe he had a good point, that no matter what our current state is, and to me, you lose, he might have make it into heaven, but he might have lost some of heaven on earth by never darkening the door of a church also. So I think we have something to take with us as maybe some comfort in COVID times, that we're still loved and we still have a Father who welcomes us in and welcomes us back. All right, we will see each other next week, I think.
Thank you, Gail.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Gail.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, we'll stop the recording.